The Appalachian Mountains, with their deep valleys and dense forests, hold stories as ancient as the very rocks that support their steep slopes. It is in this isolated setting that our story begins in McDowell County, West Virginia, around 1923, where generations of families remained isolated from the outside world for decades. The Hollister family lived in a small log cabin situated at the end of a road that became impassable during the harsh winter. The cabin was so isolated that for 4 or 5 months a year, the Hollisters saw no one but themselves. This isolation would be the perfect setting for a tragedy that would span generations. Jeremiah Hollister was the patriarch, a tall, bony man with a thick beard and penetrating blue eyes. Widowed at 42, he raised his daughter Martha alone, a girl with delicate features. Martha's mother Sarah had died during a difficult childbirth when the girl was only 6 years old. The baby, a boy, didn't survive either. Since then, father and daughter lived isolated in that small cabin. The closest neighbors were almost 10 km away, and visits were rare. The pastor from the small church tried to visit them once a year, usually in summer. He noticed that Martha, now 14, seemed increasingly withdrawn, avoiding direct eye contact with people and keeping her arms crossed over her body. Jeremiah was always a strange man, says Elena Davis, now 93, one of the few people still alive who knew the Hollisters. Even before Sarah's death, he rarely came down to town. It was Sarah who came to buy supplies, always in a hurry, always looking over her shoulder as if she feared someone might follow her. Local residents commented on the strange dynamic between father and daughter. On the rare occasions when they appeared together at the village grocery store, Martha seemed like a shadow, always one step behind her father, responding only with monosyllables when someone tried to engage in conversation. The winter of 1937 was particularly severe in the mountains. It was during this winter that Martha, then 20 years old, became pregnant with her first child. When spring finally arrived, Martha didn't come down to town with her father. Rumors began to circulate when Jeremiah was seen buying baby clothes at the grocery store. "My daughter is expecting," was all he said, his face as impassive as the mountain rocks. Suspicions grew among local residents. Martha had not been seen with any man, and no one had climbed the mountain to court her. The community began to whisper increasingly dark theories. It was Dr. William Foster, the only doctor in the region who was finally called to the Hollister cabin on a rainy night in June 1938. Martha was in labor, and complications had forced Jeremiah to seek help. What doctor Foster found in that cabin would haunt him for the rest of his life. Martha, pale and fragile, giving birth to a girl with facial features that immediately alerted the experienced doctor to the possibility of consanguinity. The girl was born with several characteristics typical of children born from close consanguineous relationships: heart defects, extra fingers, and a visibly underdeveloped jaw. She survived only 3 days. Martha never mentioned who the child's father was, but the doctor's suspicions were recorded in his diary, along with the disturbing observation that Jeremiah seemed more devastated by the child's death than would be expected of a grandfather. He held her as if she were his own daughter, wrote the doctor. He cried in a way that made me look away, as if I were witnessing something too intimate, too sacred in its perversity. In those isolated mountains, where the law rarely reached, it wasn't uncommon for families to marry among themselves. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces in an effort to keep lands within the family. But even in this context, certain boundaries were respected. The relationship between father and daughter was a taboo that few communities tolerated. check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Don't miss any shocking stories like this one that reveals the dark truths hidden in American families. Subscribe now to dive into humanity's darkest secrets. After the death of Martha's first daughter, a silence descended upon the Hollister cabin. For almost a year, no one in town saw Martha. Jeremiah came down alone to buy supplies, avoiding any attempt at conversation. In April 1939, Martha was pregnant for the second time. The child, a boy named Elijah, was born at home with the help of a local midwife, Ida Mae Jenkins, who was called only at the last moment. That house had a strange smell, Ida Mae reported years later. There was something that reminded me of a wounded animal, an odor of despair and resignation. And when I saw the baby, I understood why. The boy was born with several visible deformities. His fingers were fused, forming a kind of claw, and his eyes had different colors, one blue like Jeremiah's, the other brown like Martha's. More concerning was the abnormally large size of his head, a sign of hydrophilies. That boy won't survive the winter, Ida Mae told Jeremiah, who received the news with a nod. Surprisingly, Elijah survived not just the winter, but the next 5 years. He never learned to speak more than a few disconnected words, and his movements were limited. Martha carried him everywhere, even when he became too big for it. During these years, Martha became pregnant 2 more times. The third child, a girl named Ruth, was born with less visible deformities, but her mental development was clearly compromised. The fourth child, another boy, was still born in 1944 and was buried in the small family cemetery behind the cabin. That family always had problems with babies who were still born or died early, explains Harlan Thompson, a local historian. Records show that the Hollisters came to the mountains in the 1820s, and since then have married almost exclusively among cousins. This pattern of consanguineous marriages created a concentration of problematic genes that manifested in increasingly severe ways. In 1945, tragedy struck the family again when Elijah, then 6 years old, succumbed to pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Martha was seen at the funeral holding Ruth's hand, who was now 4 years old. Neighbors noticed that Martha appeared to be pregnant again. Martha's fifth child was born in June 1946, a girl who was named Sarah in honor of Martha's deceased mother. Unlike her older siblings, Sarah appeared relatively healthy. Her eyes were a deep blue, almost identical to Jeremiah's, and her early development seemed normal. Sarah's apparent normality brought a change in Jeremiah's behavior. He began taking her along when he went to town, exhibiting her with a pride that local residents found disturbing. He treated her as if she were his own daughter, not his granddaughter, recalls Clementine Parker, who worked at the grocery store at the time. He kept showing how smart she was, how quickly she learned, and the resemblance between them was undeniable. Same eyes, same face shape. As Sarah grew, it became evident that she had escaped the worst genetic consequences that afflicted her siblings. At 5, she sporadically attended the local school during the warmer months. The teacher, Miss Abigail Wilson, noticed that despite some learning difficulties, Sarah was considerably more advanced than her sister Ruth. It was through Sarah that the outside world began to glimpse the true nature of life in the Hollister cabin. On a rainy autumn day in 1952, Sarah showed up at school with a visible bruise on her face. When questioned by Miss Wilson, the girl finally spoke. "Daddy got angry because Mommy didn't want to sleep in his bed anymore," she said with the disconcerting innocence of a child. "He says Mommy is his that she always has been since Grandma died." Miss Wilson reported the incident to the local sheriff, John Buchanan, but without concrete evidence beyond a child's account, he was reluctant to intervene. "Those mountain families have their own customs," said the sheriff. "It's not our role to interfere unless there's a clear and immediate danger." The winter of 1952 to 1953 further isolated the Hollister cabin. When spring arrived, Martha was seen in town with Ruth and Sarah, but she appeared worn down and older than her 36 years suggested. Most alarming was Jeremiah's absence. It was only in July 1953, when a hunter got lost in the mountains and passed near the Hollister property, that the truth came to light. The hunter, Joseph Miller, reported seeing a recent grave in the small family cemetery. The rudimentary headstone had Jeremiah Hollister's name carved on it and the date of his death, January 12, 1953. "I thought it strange that no one in town knew he had died," Miller told the sheriff, "but the strangest thing was what I saw through the cabin window. Martha was sitting at the table with the two girls, and she seemed happy. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders." The summer of 1953 brought changes to the Hollister family. With Jeremiah's death, Martha seemed to have found a new freedom. She began frequenting the town more often, established a small garden, and allowed Sarah to attend school regularly. Ruth, although still limited in her development, showed signs of improvement in her behavior. It was during this period that Martha met Jacob Wheeler, a middle-aged widower who had recently moved to the region. Jacob was a carpenter who found refuge in the mountains after his wife's death. Unlike most local residents, he didn't listen to rumors about the Hollisters. "Everyone has a past," he would say. "What matters is the present and how we choose to live from here on." Friendship between Martha and Jacob grew slowly, built on casual encounters at the grocery store and brief conversations after Sunday religious services. For a woman who had lived her entire life under the oppressive control of her father, Jacob's simple kindness was like water in the desert. In October 1953, Jacob asked permission to formally court Martha. The community reacted with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. How could a decent man like Jacob be interested in a woman with Martha's past? But secrets in small communities rarely remain buried forever. On a Sunday afternoon after church, Clementine Parker approached Jacob in the church parking lot. "You know who those girls' father is, don't you?" she asked, her voice low but loaded with insinuation. Jacob, uncomfortable with the question, replied that he assumed the father was Martha's deceased husband. Clementine let out a dry laugh. "Martha was never married, Jacob. Those girls, their father is the same man who was Martha's father. Jeremiah Hollister kept his own daughter. As well, you understand what I'm saying. You're getting involved with a cursed family." The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow. He drove aimlessly along the winding mountain roads for hours trying to process what he had just heard. When he finally returned to town, it was already night. He drove to the Hollister cabin. Martha was sitting on the porch as if waiting for him. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked, her voice calm, resigned. Jacob nodded, unable to find words. "I understand if you never want to see me again," Martha continued. "But before you go, I'd like you to hear my story." And so, under the starry sky of the Appalachian Mountains, Martha Hollister told her story. How her father had begun to abuse her shortly after her mother's death. How at 14 she had tried to run away once, only to be found and dragged back to the cabin, where Jeremiah kept her chained to the foot of the bed for weeks as punishment. How over the years she had become pregnant several times, giving birth to children who carried the genetic weight of that forbidden union. "I loved them, you know," she said, silent tears streaming down her face, despite how they were conceived, despite the deformities. Despite everything, they were my children. I just wanted to protect them, give them some chance in life. Jacob listened in silence, his heart divided between horror at the story he was hearing and growing compassion for the woman before him, who had endured more than anyone should. And Jeremiah, he finally asked, how did he die? Martha looked at the starry sky for a long moment before answering. The winter was harsh. She finally said, he got sick. Pneumonia, probably. He refused to go down the mountain to see the doctor. One day, he simply didn't wake up. There was something in the way she said it, an almost imperceptible hesitation that made Jacob wonder if he was hearing the whole truth. But who was he to judge this woman after all she had been through? On the day he died, Martha continued, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in decades. It's terrible to say that about your own father, I know, but it was as if a shadow had been lifted, not just from me, but from the girls, too. Jacob took Martha's hands in his, a simple gesture of compassion that made her eyes fill with tears again. No one should go through what you went through, he said, no one. At that moment, Sarah appeared at the cabin door, her blue eyes, Jeremiah's eyes wide in the darkness. Mommy, she called, her voice small and uncertain. Martha turned to her daughter. It's all right, dear. Mr. Wheeler and I are just talking. Go back to bed. Sarah hesitated, looking cautiously at Jacob before obeying and returning inside the cabin. She looks like him, Martha said softly. Sometimes when I look at her, I see him looking back at me, and my heart freezes for a moment. But then she smiles or says something kind, and I remember that she is not him. She is herself despite everything. Have you ever wondered how many Marthas are hidden out there, suffering in silence, trapped in cycles of abuse that pass from generation to generation? Leave in the comments. Break the silence to show that we are attentive to these stories that need to be told. The following months brought an almost normal routine to the Hollister cabin. Jacob visited regularly, helping with repairs on the property and bringing small gifts for the girls. The transformation in Martha was remarkable. The woman who once avoided eye contact and flinched at the slightest noise now occasionally smiled. The relationship between Jacob and Martha became the main topic of local gossip. It's not natural, commented Abigail Simmons, one of the local matriarchs, a decent man like Jacob, getting involved with, well, we all know what she is. She didn't do anything, replied Elena Davis. She was a victim, not a perpetrator, and those girls are innocent of any sin of their parents. Meanwhile, in the mountain cabin, Martha struggled with her own internal demons. At night, after the girls were asleep, nightmares frequently woke her, sweaty and trembling, the ghost of Jeremiah still very real in her mind. Sometimes I think I see him, she confessed to Jacob, standing in the corner of the room or at the edge of the forest. I know it's not real, but it seems so real. Jacob gently suggested that she might benefit from talking to someone. Martha initially resisted the idea, fearing judgment and exposure, but when the nightmares began to affect her daily well-being, she finally agreed. Dr. Richard Montgomery, a psychiatrist who visited the larger town once a month, became an unexpected ally. A progressive man for his time, he had studied the effects of prolonged trauma and understood that Martha's behavior was not the result of some moral deficiency, but rather a natural response to years of abuse. With his support, Martha slowly began to process her trauma. It was a painful path, full of relapses and moments of despair, but also of small advances and glimpses of hope. Meanwhile, Sarah, now 7 years old, flourished in school. Her natural intelligence combined with a fierce determination to learn compensated for the occasional difficulties she faced. Due to her genetics, Ruth, although never capable of a completely independent life, developed surprising skills in sewing and crafts. But as the girls grew, inevitable questions arose. Sarah, in particular, began to ask questions about her father. Why don't I have a father like the other children? She asked Martha one night. Martha froze, the glass of water in her hand trembling slightly. How to explain something so complex and disturbing to a child? "Your grandfather Jeremiah took care of us after your father left," Martha finally said, choosing her words carefully. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it emitted the darker truth. "And where did my father go?" Sarah persisted. He wasn't ready to be a father," Martha replied, feeling the words inadequate as soon as they left her mouth. Sarah, with the perspicacity of children, realized there was more to the story than her mother was willing to share. But like many children in complicated family situations, she learned not to press certain issues. In 1956, 3 years after Jeremiah's death, Jacob asked Martha to marry him. It was a simple proposal made during a picnic in a sunny clearing near the cabin. Martha, taken by surprise, didn't respond immediately. "Are you sure?" she finally asked. "After all you know about me, about my past." Jacob took her hands in his. "I know you, Martha, not just your past, but who you are now, a survivor, a mother who would do anything for her daughters, a woman with more strength than anyone I've ever known." Martha looked at him, tears in her eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever be as normal, if I'll ever be able to be a wife in way you deserve. I'm not asking you to be something you're not," Jacob replied gently. "I'm asking to build something together at our own pace, in our own way." The wedding was a small ceremony held in the cabin itself with only a few guests. Life as Mrs. Wheeler brought a new sense of legitimacy for Martha in the community. For Sarah and Ruth, Jacob became the father figure they never had. Patient, gentle, encouraging, but the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected. In 1959, when Sarah was 13 years old, the same age Martha was when Jeremiah's abuse began, she found an old diary hidden in a box in the cabin's attic. It was her mother's diary, begun shortly after the death of her grandmother, Sarah. The yellowed pages contained the raw truth that had been carefully hidden from her, the true nature of her birth, the fact that her grandfather was also her father, the deaths of her older siblings due to genetic deformities caused by consanguinity, her mother's silent suffering for so many years. When Martha found Sarah sitting on the bed, the diary open in her lap and silent tears streaming down her face, she immediately knew what had happened. A chill spread through her body, followed by a wave of nausea so intense that she had to lean against the door to keep from falling. "Is it true?" asked Sarah, her voice small and broken. "Grandpa Jeremiah was my father." Martha closed her eyes as if she could block out the reality of the situation. But when she opened them again, her daughter was still there, waiting for an answer that would change her life forever. "Yes," Martha finally said, the word coming out like a painful sigh. "Yes, it's true." The revelation of the truth to Sarah shook the foundations of the Wheeler-Hollister family. The teenager became withdrawn and silent. She stopped attending school for several weeks, fearing that somehow her classmates could see the mark of her origin on her face. "I'm a freak," she told Martha during a painful discussion. "Half of my genes come from the same place. Is that why Ruth is the way she is? Is that why my other siblings died and me? What's wrong with me that we haven't discovered yet?" Martha, devastated by her daughter's pain, but determined not to hide behind lies anymore, explained everything. The genetic risks of consanguinity, why some children are more affected than others, and the fact that Sarah seemed to have escaped the worst physical consequences. "But that doesn't mean I'm okay," argued Sarah. "What if I have children someday? Will they inherit this contamination?" It was Jacob who suggested they consult a specialist in genetics. Dr. Benjamin Rosen, a Jewish doctor who worked at a university in Philadelphia, was known for his pioneering work in human genetics. After exchanging correspondence with him, the family made the long journey to Pennsylvania for a consultation. "You are not a freak, my dear," he said after conducting several examinations. You are a young woman who had the misfortune to be born in difficult circumstances, but that doesn't define who you are or who you can become." He explained to Sarah how genetics works, how each person carries potentially problematic recessive genes, but these genes generally don't cause problems unless they are paired with similar genes from another parent. If you marry someone with no genetic relation to your family, your children will probably be as healthy as any other child. He said, "The important thing is that your future partner has no connection to the Hollister lineage." The consultation with Dr. Rosen marked a turning point for Sarah. Although the truth about her origins was still painful, she began to separate that truth from her personal identity. She wasn't just the daughter of incest. She was Sarah Wheeler, having officially adopted Jacob's surname, a young woman with her own dreams and possibilities. Life in the mountain cabin slowly found a new balance. Ruth, now 18 years old, continued to develop her talent for crafts. Her quilts and tapestries began to gain recognition beyond the local community. In 1962, Sarah, at 16, met Michael Prescott, the son of a university professor who had moved to the region to study the culture and music of the Appalachian Mountains. Michael quickly became her friend and eventually her first love. When Sarah finally gathered the courage to tell Michael about her family history, fearing his rejection, he surprised her with his response. "My father is Jewish," he said. "My grandparents escaped the prams in Russia. I know what it's like to carry the weight of family history, Sarah. I know what it's like to be judged not for who you are, but for what other people think you represent." The romance between Sarah and Michael flourished. When Sarah received a scholarship to study nursing at West Virginia University, an extraordinary achievement for a young woman of her background, Michael supported her decision. Martha watched her daughter's development with a mixture of pride and amazement. Sarah was charting a path that she herself never had the opportunity to consider. Higher education, a career, the freedom to choose her own partner and determine her own destiny. In 1965, when Sarah was in her final year of nursing school, she and Michael married in a small ceremony in the university chapel. Martha, dressed in a light blue outfit, never looked as radiant at the moment when she saw her daughter walking down the aisle toward a future that she herself could never have imagined. That same year, Dr. Montgomery suggested that Martha consider sharing her story more broadly. The field of psychology was beginning to recognize the prevalence and impact of child abuse and incest, topics that were previously almost completely taboo. "Your experience," told anonymously, "could help professionals better understand how to identify and help victims," he explained. "And perhaps more importantly, it could help other women and girls in similar situations know that they are not alone." After months of careful consideration and discussions with Jacob and her daughters, Martha agreed to be interviewed for an academic study on survivors of prolonged family abuse. Her case, published under the pseudonym Patient H, became one of the most cited in the emerging literature on trauma and resilience. In 1970, Ruth passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 29. Heart complications, probably related to her genetics, led to silent heart failure. She departed, surrounded by her creations, quilts, tapestries, and embroideries that told stories in fabric when she couldn't express them in words. Sarah, now a respected nurse and mother of 2 healthy children, Elizabeth and James, returned for the funeral with Michael and the children. It was the first time that Elizabeth, 5 years old, and James, 3, visited the mountain cabin where their mother had grown up. Martha, now 53 years old, watched her grandchildren playing in the same clearing where she herself had played as a child, where Sarah had taken her first steps, where Ruth had sat to sew in the sunlight. There was a continuity there, but also a deep and necessary break from the past. "They'll never know, will they?" she asked Sarah as they watched the children, about Jeremiah, about everything. Sarah looked at her mother, the blue eyes, Jeremiah's eyes, now softened by wisdom and compassion. One day, when they're older, I'll tell them a version of the story, she replied. Not all the details, but enough for them to understand where we came from, what we overcame. I want them to know about the grandmother's strength, how you broke a cycle that could have continued for generations. Martha felt tears burning in her eyes. Do you think it's possible really breaking the cycle after so many generations? Sarah smiled, a smile that carried as much knowledge as hope. Look at them, Mom. Look at me, at Michael, at you and Jacob. We've already broken it. In that moment, as the sun set behind the Appalachian Mountains, bathing the clearing in a golden light, Martha Hollister Wheeler finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon the children, that with love, courage, and truth, even the darkest stories could give way to new beginnings. The years passed. The mountains remained silent witnesses to generations of pain and healing. The Hollister cabin, eventually abandoned after the deaths of Martha and Jacob in 1985, slowly returned to the earth. The small family cemetery became a peaceful place, visited only occasionally by Sarah and later by her children and grandchildren. The story of the Hollister Wheeler family now lives mainly in academic memory, in the archives of studies on family abuse and human resilience, and in the stories passed down through generations of Sarah's family. What was once a cycle of abuse and trauma became a narrative of overcoming and hope. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Don't miss any impactful stories like this one that reveals the dark truths hidden in American families. Subscribe now to continue exploring humanity's darkest secrets. If you watched until here, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Don't forget to leave your like and share this story with people you know would be impacted by this revelation about the dark side of life in the Appalachian Mountains.